Colombia. So this is what gives basically or defines the priorities for the ISPN. And so the ISPN, and very briefly here, the knowledge sharing approach that it utilizes is, on the one hand, what is labeled by the ISPN as critical transfer. So in other words, there are no recipes here. It's not a matter of saying we're going to take Bolsa Familia to Peru so that Peru can copy it, but rather it's really have the countries meet and discuss the different ways that these programs can be implemented. Each country has to analyze their own institutional capabilities and see where probably they have similar features as in another country, but where they differ in a very significant way, and then at the end tailor programs that are specific to their own reality. At the same time, the ISPN has nurtured partnerships in order to carry out its aims, and these partnerships are academic, with civil society, and interagency with particular UN agencies. In terms of academic partnerships, for instance, there's one with Catholic University of Chile, with the Center for Public Policy, and together with them, ISPN offers a diploma on social protection for the staff members of ministries of social development. With civil society, or the ISPN initiated several agreements, one of them, for instance, with the Inter-American Foundation in Washington, D.C., that is oriented towards grassroots development in the region. And with many UN agencies, there's also common aspects that are dealt with in terms of decent work with the ILO, children's rights with UNICEF, gender issues with UN Women, and so forth. Another interesting thing that ISPN has pioneered really is it's not only the ministries of social development that are involved in social protection. It's also ministries of labor, ministries of education and health. As I said before, CCTs really are based on poor families receiving a transfer, but to the extent that they use the resources from the health sector and the education sector. So there has to be an intersector approach to social protection. And ISPN then set up several meetings, for instance, between ministries of labor and ministries of social development in order to enhance this kind of collaboration. And finally, also much of South-South cooperation documents and analysis emphasize the bilateral and triangular aspects of cooperation. But ISPN is, of course, multilateral, but emphasizing that through this multilateral effort, one can even enhance bilateral and triangular aspects of cooperation. For example, you can have a bilateral relationship between Brazil and Peru, like I mentioned, and probably it will be very fruitful and very interesting and have very positive outcomes. But the point is that nobody will know about this except for the two countries involved. But if a multilateral approach system is also somehow collecting that information and then putting it, making it available for the rest of the countries, there is value added in terms of both the bilateral and triangular efforts. And, well, the ISPN toolbox in order to do all this is, on the one hand, a permanent updating of portfolios for each country and in identifying their supply and demand, and then being able to match, for instance, the needs of a particular country with the strengths of another country, and devising in that way cooperation between sets of countries. And that is done through conventional face-to-face knowledge sharing, very well. The diploma program that I mentioned with Catholic University and also with University of the West Indies in the Caribbean now. And we have seminars, workshops, and particularly internships. They have proved to be quite also popular in this ISPN effort. Also using more and more the knowledge portal that has been set up, and webinars and that kind of those tools are also used quite a bit. And finally, let me refer to this proactive aspect of some Latin American countries. Because what we saw in meetings with the countries and in inquiring about their cooperation activities is that several of them, in particular Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, and Chile, were really in the business, sort of to say, of exporting their social policy. So we didn't have anymore the passive sort of aspect of countries that were simply receiving knowledge, information, and so forth, or passively exchanging with others whatever they had managed to build in terms of their social policy. But rather, a very clear-cut effort to integrate social policy into their foreign aid policy. And this is, of course, mostly it's clearer than the other countries in the case of Brazil. And these are countries that, on the whole, they have a foreign policy that embraces globalization. They have developed international cooperation agency. Mexico has recently done so. Brazil has ABC, which is Agencia Brasileira de Cooperación. Chile has AXI, and Colombia has very recently also come up with their own agency, which is dependent on the presidency. So they have the infrastructure, and their ministries of social development also have within them specialized units or departments in international cooperation. So again, they have really the basic infrastructure, like I said, in order to do this, this international cooperation. And if you look at where these countries are active, and this is based again on information that they provided to us in two meetings that we had in Brazil in the year 2010 and then in 2011. And you see the case of Colombia. Colombia very active, mainly within the region, with their programa Juntos, the Familias en Acción, which is their social protection scheme. Many countries are very interested in CISVEN, which is their system for their information system, where they have the databases of the poorest families in the country. And so, again, they're very active within the Americas, even though lately they've also been in regions of in Bangladesh and in the Philippines. The case of Chile, again, for such a small country, you see that active in all of the Americas, and in particular, the most active of all in the Caribbean. And again, there are political aspects and contexts that need to be analyzed. Back then, when this was going on 4, 5, 6 years ago in the Caribbean, Chile was having a problem with its energy supplies, which had recently been cut off from Argentina. And so they were signing an agreement with Trinidad and Tobago, which was to provide gas for the Chilean economy. Chile had opened 2 embassies in Jamaica first and in Trinidad and Tobago after. Chile was very interested in expanding their market there for their wine and fresh fruit as a result of a new Copa Airlines had opened a new route going from Panama to Trinidad and Tobago, which then meant that exports from Chile did not have to come through Miami, which is a very complex situation when you're exporting fresh fruit. So all these aspects, again, were very important in terms of Chile wanting to have a bigger footprint in the Caribbean. And its social protection programs were very much in demand from these countries. And Mexico, through Sede Sola and Oportunidades, again, extremely active throughout the world, really. An interesting thing that we found out in Mexico is that Mexico, unlike Brazil, does most of this cooperation, though, in collaboration with mainly the banks, with the IDB and the World Bank. So mainly, let's say the World Bank sees an opportunity in some African country in order to replicate in some ways Oportunidades. They will get in touch with the Mexican authorities and then program some kind of cooperation activity. But Mexico, again, extremely active throughout the world. And last, the case of Brazil, of course, in particular, very active in Africa, where they have many economic interests in terms of exporting different goods and providing know-how in different areas. The case of Brazil, again, is the most interesting, perhaps because they clearly go at it alone. I mean, not with the banks, but rather with their own resources, with the Itamaraty, which is their Ministry of Foreign Affairs, and ABC, their cooperation agency, and the Ministry of Social Development, which has developed quite a bit of expertise in terms of exporting the Bolsa Familia. Aside from social policy, though, or very much related to it, they're also very active in health and in agriculture. Agriculture is a big thing also, whereby lately Brazil has become quite a leader in exporting policy. So all this leads to interesting questions regarding some countries, especially Brazil, being able now to export or apply soft power. I mean, soft power, which, you know, in the analysis of NAI, was mainly something that the US and other developed countries in Europe were active in. Now what we're finding is really that countries like Brazil are also active in the field of soft power, which is particularly important for a country like Brazil that has aspirations to eventually join the Security Council at the UN, for example. So all these are elements that certainly are favorable and will aid Brazil in that kind of effort. If you look also at Brazil within the context of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, which they're lumped together because of certain economic features, it's interesting to note that Brazil within BRICS is really the only one that has a well-known social policy programs in place. There's nothing comparable to Bolsa Familia in Russia or India or in any other of the BRICS. So with that, I want to end by saying that these are things that we're studying at present, doing some research on these matters. So thank you. I'm sorry I took a bit longer than what was anticipated, but got carried away, I guess.
Shall we take some questions?
Sure, yeah.
Questions? Well, I have a bunch of them, but to start. Clearly, as someone who thinks in very long-term time frames, it would seem that the social protection programs have some kind of tendency to, or might have some kind of tendency to compete. I know they're collaborating also, but compete with some state functions that are very well established, like health and education and infrastructure, etc. I realize that social protection programs are meant to enhance the usefulness of those functions, particularly health and education. But do you see that there's a potential for competition that might at crunch time, at a moment when there isn't enough in the way of money to actually then topple the social protection functions because they just cannot do everything?
Before I answer your question, Franco, just say also that what I have here is several documents and brochures about the ISDN that if anybody's interested, please feel free to take them. And of course, there are not that many, but if others are interested, I'll be very happy to send them via PDF so that you can have these documents. It's very interesting what you point out because the competition will always be there. Ministries anywhere in the world are institutions that have history, legacies, that are of course very strong, particularly in Latin America. Health, for instance, the medical profession is behind that, and politically very powerful. So it's not, of course, easy to maintain this cooperation, in particular when there could be a moment when the resources are scarce. However, two things. One is that together with the creation of ministries of social development, what also has taken place is the enhancement of what is called the social cabinet in most countries, which comprises basically all the ministers of the social sector, and leadership has been given to coordinators to the Ministry of Social Development. But this really to counter, in many ways, the influence of perhaps the most powerful of all ministries, which is finance. For all practical purposes, social policy was defined until very recently, and even up to now, by the Ministry of Finance. I mean, that's where really the pie is cut and the monies they are designated and handed over to different sectors. These social cabinets then have the purpose then of sort of establishing a more level playing field in terms of the discussions with the ministries of finance. And finally, I think, though, the one thing that protects ministries of social development, and more than that, the social protection, social policy scheme, is the fact that most presidents, and we know our countries are presidential regimes, and presidents see in these programs very immediate rewards and benefits. Some studies in political science have already established that voters in Brazil and in Mexico that have been beneficiaries, areas where they are beneficiaries of oportunidades or Bolsa Familia, tend to vote for the government that has supported these programs. So for politicians and presidents, this is a win-win situation. It's cheap. Again, they take up only a small fraction of GDP, but the rewards are enormous in terms of mobilizing masses of voters that in election day can prove to be extremely important for the political designs of the party.
You mentioned that voters have a tendency of voting for the president that has been kind to them. And that brings to me the question, is there a way to understand how Alan Garcia was elected again in Alan de Loco, nonetheless he was elected? Can one understand that within this context, that he's done a little bit of nice-looking benefits to poor people that have the votes? So how should one understand it? That the local president.
Again, I think that the issue of local politics in Peru is certainly broader than what we've been looking at. And Peru certainly does have their social protection schemes and traditional cash transfers and so forth. what's interesting to note here also in a way in response to Franco is that once you have these programs established, and there's an infrastructure in terms of institutional infrastructure, like a ministry, and in the case of Chile, for instance, whereby the resources that are being assigned to these programs do not rely on a presidential decree, but rather have been legislated. So it transcends any given political regime, any particular government. It becomes what they call in Latin America a state policy. So again, in a country like Chile, for instance, you have now, for the past 4 years, government to the right, Sebastián Piñera, but he has left untouched the social policies that were enacted during the concertación years of the past. To a great extent, because again, that has been legislated, it's there in the law, and the budgets have to consider that as a matter of, again, a legal basis. So, again, I think that the Peruvian case, going from Fujimori to Garcia, Ibarra, it has its own dynamics, the situation with Senador Reynoso, and so many aspects that are very unique to Peru. But I think what's interesting is that Ibarra, which at first everybody thought would join the ALBA group, would be very close to maybe the Venezuelan group, has maintained quite a bit of independence. And on the contrary, has taken more market-oriented measures that resemble it more to Colombia and Chile.
Can I ask another question? Venezuela seems to be an outlier in many ways. Not because it hasn't practiced social protection, but perhaps because it's practiced it too much at the expense of the vitality and survivability of many aspects of the private sector. Would you regard the payoff in this very small investment in social protection policies to have been much greater than the enormous investment that Chavez did and under Maduro continues in policies that go well beyond just social protection, that means mostly socializing, means of production, and so on and so forth. In other words, how do you view the Venezuelan attempts, considering the relatively high payoff of such a small investment that you have been looking at for some time?
Well, obviously, I think Venezuela is attempting to implement a revolution in the country, literally create what they call the socialismo del siglo XXI. At the ISPN, we approached many times the Venezuelan authorities in trying to have them participate in the exchange of knowledge in terms of social policy. We were interested in the misiones. That's the way they call the different social policies for children, education, the Misión Simoncito, and the others. And we asked them, we need to know more about this. Why don't you share it with the other countries? And unfortunately, unlike a country again like Chile, which maybe to exaggerate a bit in terms of everything they do, there's a registry of it in terms of documents, analysis, evaluations, reports, you name it, it's there. So it's very easy when you want to share knowledge because it's available. Whereas with the Venezuelans, we could never get even a brochure or something. We were promised that they would send it to us. We never did get anything. So it was complicated because in my view, apparently there is no really a conventional, perhaps from our point of view, analysis and registry of what is being done, what works, what doesn't work, what is the evaluation, what does the evaluation say, and so forth. Venezuelans have been also involved in the discussion with ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, because they were telling ECLAC, well, we're not well represented here because your poverty lines in particular are based on income. But in our case, we do a lot of transfers in kind, and you're not taking that into account. But we provide people with food, with shelter, clothing in some cases, and so that is a complete transfer that the country is doing, but it's not reflected on your statistics. So they're doing things different, clearly. Nobody really knows what the impact of the policies are at this point. However, though, ECLAC is reporting, after taking into consideration the complaints of the Venezuelan government, that Venezuela is making great strides in terms of reducing the poverty. That is the latest ECLAC report since for the period of the state. At the same time, of course, they are exporting to places like Bolivia, Nicaragua, Ecuador, what is mainly a Cuban policy. So it's really triangular. Venezuela provides the funding, but the know-how comes from really the health sector and education sectors of Cuba, which